Bore da, croeso I Caerfyrddin ac I lle creadigol a dynamic hwn yn Yr Egin ar gyfer ein Cyfarfod Cenedlaethol heddiw. Mae'n ymddangos fel breintiau ar hyn o bryd I gael cyfarfod wyneb yn wyneb ac rydym yn gobeithio bod eich taith yma wedi bod yn cyfforddus ac nad ydych chi wedi cael gormod o dallfu ar deithio. Fy enw I yw Jessie Buchanan, fi yw cydlynydd gyda'n gilydd dros Newid, un o sawl sefydliad sy'n aelodau o'r tîm cynllunio a drefnodd yr agenda ar gyfer y diwrnod. Mae wedi bod yn bleser gweithio gyda Partneriaeth Ymchwil y Trydydd sector Brifysgol Caerfyrddin, swyddfa ymchwil heriau Lleol Brifysgol Aberystwyth a'r LPIP Cymru Wledig gan arweiniad Brifysgol Aberystwyth. Good morning. Welcome to beautiful Carmarthen and to this creative and dynamic space at Yr Egin for our national meeting today. It does seem a privilege at this time to meet in person, and we very much hope that your journey here was comfortable and that you avoided too many travel disruptions. It is a pleasure to welcome people here from across the sectors here in Wales, and delighted also to welcome delegates from across the Atlantic and from New Zealand. My name is Jessie Buchanan. I'm the coordinator of Together for Change, one of several organisations that are members of the planning team who organised the agenda for the day. It has been an absolute pleasure to work together with Cardiff University's Third Sector Research Partnership, Swansea University's Local Challenges Research Office and the Aberystwyth University-led Cymru Wledig LPIP for Rural Wales. All those involved today are wearing yellow badges. Mine's here. There's a few around the room. So please do make contact with us if you would like to know more about the exciting partnership work universities are doing to support communities in R&D. But to set the scene for the day, these are challenging times. Austerity, inequality, the climate emergency are all taking their toll on people and government. Too often, the response to this is sometimes more of the same, with less resources, or to shift that responsibility down the line to someone else, for example, the third or the voluntary sector, or indeed communities themselves. Wales has a world-class legislation that puts people front and centre to tackle need and boost well-being. We know this here in Wales. But despite our best efforts, there is a clear implementation gap. We also know this. We have a wealth of strategies, initiatives, collaborations and co-productions, but something sometimes becomes lost in translation. But there is so much that is positive. There are good things, there's commitment to work, there's energy, there's innovation, there's people doing fantastic things. But the knowledge from these initiatives sometimes isn't spread to help others, or it gets held at that moment in time on the same path. And frameworks and strategies too often lack impact, or they just sit on the shelf. So in this context, and reflecting the shared challenges, Together for Change have commissioned research to reflect on how, working with others, communities could have more impact on living well. How working with communities, organisations could support transformational change. Over a 6-month period, a shared perspective has begun to emerge, and I think our meeting today will further add to that perspective with discussions and presentations on projects which will bring into sharp relief some of the exciting work underway in Wales and the challenges and enablers that the partnerships involved face. This will provide an opportunity to look at the picture nationally, that's why we're here, and what we can do in Wales together and how this impacts communities. Hoffwn nawr, gyflwyno Babs Lewis ar ymchwil. Mae biograffiad yn dangos y cofaith o brofiad a gwybodaeth mae hi wedi chyfrannu y prosiect. Droi nawr ar Babs I siarad am y hyn a wnaethom, sut a gwnaethom o pam, a beth a ddysgom a beth allai digwydd nesaf. I would like to now introduce Babs Lewis and the research. Babs's biography shows the wealth of experience and knowledge she has brought to the research project. Over to Babs to talk about what you did, how we did it, and why. Thank you, Babs.
Right. Jessie, you're going to have to sort out a problem for me immediately. Slides. Slides, who needs them? Hey, yeah, brilliant. Oh, croeso I bawb. Diolch am ddod heddiw. Thank you very much for coming and welcome everyone. This piece of research, well, the aim of the Better Together research really was to build insights, working with sector partners, with interviewees, really looking in depth at what people's response in the system and the sector was, what was happening out there. So we got together for Change and myself, identified key organisations, key individuals to see who we needed to talk to get a handle on what was happening. Now, we did 12 one-to-one in-depth interviews with people chosen together, and these participants came from all areas of Wales. They all held different positions. They all had very different perspectives and experience. They came from national organisations, regional, local. They were experts in systems, experts in policy and future thinking. But they all had a wealth of experience of community-led approaches and initiatives. And we worked with them really in a dynamic process. As themes emerged from each of the interviews or from Together for Change's wider engagement, we went back to Together for Change. We developed and explored those themes to compare and contrast what we were hearing coming from these different areas of the sector. And then we looked at these interviews really from key questions. We attached key questions to the work we were doing. So let's have a look at those questions. Oh, and I should say, Together for Change's work involved 30 community groups, so very extensive, wider engagement as well as the core foundation of the one-to-one interviews. So how did we do it and why did we do it this way? We took a user-led approach, a qualitative research method really, to properly understand people's experience of the system. And we asked them a series of these guided questions really on how they interacted with the sector, with the system as it were. And we asked each person really to reflect on the following questions from their particular point of view, from their perspective. And the questions we asked were how their organisation supports grassroots groups to maximise their impact. What would help increase that impact? Where were the gaps in current support that they could see and that they experienced every day? And how could these gaps be strengthened in their view? What could they see being done that would make things better? Now, not all the organisations dealt directly with grassroots groups, but all of them had a policy or a vision or a strategy to impact the community, to bring those well-being goals and priorities that are embedded in Welsh legislation. So they were all able to reflect on it from their differing viewpoints. We asked people for candid responses. We asked for their honesty. And although all their work would have contained organisational perspectives, really they were talking from their own point of view. So, I'll just move on. What did we hear? Well, a lot of what we heard concentrates on the barriers. But I've got to say, in the context of today's work, that shouldn't be taken as not understanding the great work that's going on locally, the great work that's going on with universities. There are so many people in Wales and organisations that are trying to turn the tanker, and we'll hear a lot about that today. So I wouldn't want any of this work, which is a distillation of what we heard, to be taken as the whole picture. It's just the urgency, really, of what people were telling us. They were telling us about the barriers to effective cross-sector collaboration. And that phrase, cross-sector collaboration, that was really important to our interviewees. They felt that was the key to transformational change, working together. And of course, this seminar is called Better Together. That was the overwhelming theme we were hearing from all our engagement, both the focused one-to-ones and wider, really. So these barriers that were getting in the way of change, first and foremost, a lack of community development policy. Navigating community development, they said, was complex. Often it was contradictory and competitive because it falls across so many different policy or funding streams that it was difficult. People were getting lost in the mix. Add to that the financial pressures. Well, maybe I don't need to say too much about that, but what was being described was short-term, top-down, competitive, as we've mentioned, approaches that resulted in organisations struggling for sustainability. And that sustainability was key to them. They couldn't move on and develop their practice because of the constant need to sustain what they were doing. So and that in itself then created a sense that change was almost impossible, that maybe it couldn't happen because you're constantly spinning that hamster wheel and you can't get off to do things differently. So these financial pressures then left no room, no space really for the working on, the reflecting on how we move forward, how we learn from what we're doing, and how we then develop that, whether it's to scale or spread, or whether it's development locally. Not everything needs to scale and spread nationally, but how do you reflect on what you're learning when you haven't got the time and you haven't got the space? So they described a system where grassroots groups often struggled with these funding and governance demands, and that felt inequitable and exclusionary in itself. This lack of time and space got in the way of cultural change. And again, people felt really strongly that it was cultural change we needed. We needed a different mindset, a different set of assumptions and behaviours, a cultural change to transform what was going on. People identified a lack of support to forge more effective relationships. That was a very big theme. Relationships with communities around a platform for change, around doing things differently. So again, this point of relationships really, everybody wanted or saw that as a key element of how you build sustainability. Cross-sector, place-based approaches needed relationships. You couldn't do anything on your own. You needed other people in the room with you. So the last one here, lack of community-based data collection, research and evaluation. I'm almost ashamed to say that in this room because there's so much good work in the universities, and I've talked to people this morning about that work. This really came across as a different point. Not that there isn't good work going on, but how can we start to work with communities to have community-led data collection? And we'll say more about that in a minute on one of the later slides. But people felt that there needed to be more of the community perspective in how we did things, what we collected, and how we interpreted what we collected. So that's what we heard and what we learned. Bringing the interviews and the wider engagement together, 4 clear themes emerged as essential to create change. And you see them set out here. Strategic leadership across the sector, space for joined-up thinking, that community-led data research and evaluation, and equitable, inclusive community funding to create change. So that switch to looking at communities. So when people were talking about this strategic leadership, what they were mentioning or were talking about to us was something that champions change, so that people and organisations can move beyond managed decline. Whether this is a voice that articulates and advocates for community-led cross-sector approaches, or support for organisations to work with communities and with each other on things like collecting data from a community perspective, or working on experiments locally to try and address need directly within the community. So space for joined up thinking. Well, people wanted somewhere or something that enabled them to share, to learn, to develop ideas and approaches and solutions together. A key point that emerged from a lot of the people we talked to was better ways to share information, because we're information rich. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has a whole folder on my emails that's full of reports I should read. And I'm probably never going to get around to it. There's a lot out there, but what are we doing with it? People were, how do I navigate that information? How do I find the things that are relevant to me? How do I pull them into my world, and how do I reflect to the rest of the ecosystem what I'm doing and what's important about what I'm doing. So they wanted better ways to manage information. And I think part of that problem was that focus on no space or capacity to reflect, not having space within the daily grind to do that future thinking, to do that learning from what they're doing. So they wanted support to develop capacity to reflect as well. They felt that it's not easy. It's not easy when you're doing your best to turn around and look at an initiative that you're funded for and that your future depends on, and then say, well, actually, that didn't work. So how do you find a safe space when you've got to go back to those funders and ask for more to share that difficult learning with them, that actually that wasn't right or didn't entirely work, and they wanted support to be able to do that, those hard yards, as it were. Now, we've mentioned this data research and evaluation, and we've got to acknowledge the work that's being done with the universities and other organisations that are all here today, and including Together for Change itself, on research and working with communities. But what people were talking about to us was, and this phrase to me summed it up, focused metrics that go beyond traditional economic indicators to measure what matters to people. It was felt that people hadn't been engaged really in thinking about what made them feel good, what boosted their well-being, you know, how that legislation related to their everyday experience of life in their communities. So that's what they were looking for there. Something that could underpin real change and develop into the wider system of research that we've got. The last one there, equitable, inclusive community funding. Well, pretty much all the interviewees felt that the current system was broken because it commissioned top-down, short-term, competitive funding that got in the way of partnership working. They wanted to see funding for community-led approaches, and they saw that really as essential for system change. So, okay, what's next? So we asked people, well, what do you want then? We've heard about the barriers, we've taken some learning from that, but what might help deliver that wish list? And these are the things they came out with. A partnership or platform that could help them work with communities and others to articulate that case for change. Somewhere that actually had that as a focus. They wanted support. They wanted something that would provide support to develop that partnership working that we've talked about, that would help join the dots, and that would promote and develop the research and data that could make the case for change and would also fuel partnership working. They wanted help really to develop the capacity and skills to work differently together, and capacity and skills not just in the community but with each other. Again, those difficult conversations. They wanted dedicated spaces to explore what works with communities. They felt the need for a facilitation to help people and organisations reflect on the impact of their work honestly and the work of others, because that's difficult to do when you're under pressure. And they wanted direct engagement with communities. They wanted to see more experimentation, although we do have a lot happening in our communities, but they wanted that experimentation to build. They wanted funding that built. So not just an initiative, but funding that looked at how you build that initiative into something bigger over a period of time. So now that's the wish list, but you know, this is a complicated system, and there's a lot going on. So people also came with a series of warnings. They were very clear that given everything that's happening, any work to support change must take into account the potential for duplication. I think we already have quite a lot of duplication in the system. So what they wanted to see was working together, joining the dots, as it were, whatever came forward in the future to make this case for change, making it together, bringing those organisations and partners to create a unified vision almost. And then appreciating systemic pressures, very much key to any future approaches, is a practical and accessible support that really offers to take the pressure off people, not require them to do more because they already feel that they're really overwhelmed with the demands on them. Now, there are two other things that people wanted us to be aware of when we're doing this future thinking. Aware of the time it takes to forge effective partnerships. You've got to build trust, especially if you're working across national boundaries, cross-sector working. Nothing can be done until partners have had that time to work together in small ways and build on that to be able to forge bigger, more effective partnerships, or to be able to drill down to what really matters. And the final thing that they wanted us to be aware of is you've got to have a clear vision. You've got to have some clarity around what you're attempting to do and something that people can get into with you, can develop with you, and will avoid that silo thinking or that tram lines where we're all going in our own direction and we're not looking at what we have in common, what we share, and how that can build into a future focus. So I don't think I've taken up anything like enough time. It's the trouble with being South Walian from Port Talbot. I speak at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I do beg your pardon. Anyway, diolch am wrando. Thank you for listening. That's just a taste of the detailed responses that we had. And I do apologise for the broad brush of it, but I think you probably found a lot in that you will have recognised yourselves, and a lot that you want to dig into, down into the detail and take apart and really think about. We've got this slide now, what resonates, what rings alarm bells. We want to hear from you, your thoughts, your insights, to help us all move forward together. But I'm going to hand now back to Sue. Thank you, Sue.